Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Unauthorized Disclosure Podcast. I'm Kevin Gosztola, joined by co-host Rania Khalek. Hello, Rania.
Hey, Kevin, how you doing?
And we're very pleased to have as our guest Andrea Ritchie. Andrea is a Black lesbian immigrant. She's the author of the book Invisible No More: Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color. She's the co-author of No More Police: A Case for Abolition, also the co-author of Queer Injustice, a book that she wrote with Joey Mogul and Kay Whitlock, and the co-founder of Interrupting Criminalization. We're very pleased to have her on this show. Thank you, Andrea.
Thanks so much, Kevin and Rania, for having me.
And so we invited you to come on. We want to have a conversation about what organizing looks like after Roe v. Wade has been overturned, as far as abortion decriminalization and doing work to support abortion access, and also to put that in this larger context in which you work in, which connects all these different struggles against criminalization. So to begin, I always feel like we should begin broadly before we get too specific. So maybe you want to say a little bit about your work, what you do. I know I found you through Interrupting Criminalization, and you can discuss your assessment of where we are currently before we get into some of the specifics.
Sure. I mean, I come to this conversation from over 30 years of organizing for reproductive justice and specifically access to abortion, and organizing against policing and state violence, particularly as it impacts Black women, women of color, and queer and trans people of color. So this moment is like at the intersection of the last 30 years of work that I've been doing, and particularly also the knowledge and fact that for Black women, queer, trans people, also disabled people, migrants, people living with HIV, drug users, pregnant people, and many of us, so many more of us, that criminalization comes through access to medical care, and that's been the case for a very long time, including in the context of abortion care. So I think there's no question that this moment is a dramatic shift in the legal landscape. It's one that we feared when I first started organizing around the time of Planned Parenthood v. Casey. And at the same time, it's one that has existed for a long time for Black women, queer and trans folks, and women, queer and trans folks of color, and migrants, and disabled people, because access to abortion, and certainly for Indigenous people as well, because what Planned Parenthood v. Casey said was, we don't have to pay for it. We don't have to make sure that you actually have access to it in practice, in terms of economic realities, in terms of the requirements and hoops you have to jump through, in terms of having access to a clinic near where you live, in terms of all of those things. For 30 years, people have effectively been denied access, and long before that, on those grounds. And so, and then the other thing is that for criminalized populations, pregnancy, miscarriages, self-managed abortion, and unfavorable termination of pregnancies in many forms has already been criminalized. And for folks who are criminalized, access to abortion, particularly if you're incarcerated or in immigration detention, but also if you're on probation, parole, or other state surveillance, has also effectively been denied. So I guess that's an area that we've been aware of and organizing around that for a long time. So it's not like people are suddenly starting to organize against the criminalization of abortion. Many of us have been organizing around it for a very long time. And certainly at Interrupting Criminalization, which I co-founded with my No More Police co-author, Mariam Kaba, in 2019, we were already thinking about how the Trump administration and sort of the right wing was moving its agenda through criminalization of sexual and reproductive and gender autonomy, as it moves every agenda, right? As the right moves every agenda, using criminalization as the front wedge. And so we had already started bringing folks together across anti-criminalization movement and movement for reproductive justice to think about what's happening at those intersections and how we can intervene in the organizing around those intersections.
You know, and I think what's so concerning now, though, of course, for someone like you, it shouldn't be all too surprising considering the work you've been doing for the last several decades, but just seeing what's being called the abortion abolition movement, or I guess, where they actually like these really just like, they call them marginal, but they're actually involved in pushing certain bills through state legislators. And I think one in Oklahoma like almost made it through. And that is the actual, they don't want abortion to just be illegal, which is bad enough. And you just talked about some of the ways that that's been bad, even worse for people in already very vulnerable and precarious situations, who the criminal justice system or the criminal injustice system is already targeting. But the idea of actually prosecuting people who get abortions in various ways. And this is becoming a real possibility to the point where, you know, this might sound extreme to some, but I mean, the New York Times was even talking about this, how like in certain states, if they can relabel abortion as actual homicide, those states that have death penalties for homicide, you could actually see a situation where somebody is being prosecuted and facing potential death penalty for getting an abortion, if they are able to be prosecuted in those states. So can you talk about the real danger here? Because this anti-abortion movement, which is like a generous term to use, I think, for what it actually is, isn't interested in just stopping here where it's already bad enough. They want to go much further.
I think that's absolutely right. And again, I just want to point out that prosecutions of people for either self-managed abortions or what are perceived to be unauthorized abortions has been ongoing. And groups like the National Advocates for Pregnant Women and If, When, How, and Sister Reach and many others have been documenting those prosecutions. They haven't happened necessarily under laws specifically criminalizing abortion, but they have happened under laws, either child endangerment laws or any law really, like concealing remains or not reporting a death or unauthorized use of medication or prescriptions or and I think that goes to thinking about what the process of criminalization is, which is basically deciding who's going to be targeted for punishment by the state, and then kind of any law will do, right? There's many laws out there that can be deployed to that purpose. I think the world became aware of that when Purvi Shah was prosecuted in Indiana under Mike Pence for unfavorable termination of a pregnancy, which they decided was an unauthorized abortion, and prosecuted her. And only thanks to organizing around that was that prosecution brought to light. But there's hundreds of pregnant people who have been prosecuted around theories of self-managed abortion or unfavorable end to pregnancy or drug use during pregnancy, which led to loss of pregnancy for a long time. So it's a danger that's definitely escalating, but it's one that has existed. And I think you're absolutely right that this is part of a much larger agenda that is about denying sexual, reproductive, and gender autonomy and exercising control over sexuality, all aspects of reproduction and reproductive health, and enforcing patriarchy, right? And we're seeing that in the ways that just today, many laws went into, or this past week, many laws went into effect around controlling people's sexuality or ability to discuss sexuality or ability to say gay or queer or trans. And certainly we're seeing that in the denial of and criminalization of gender affirming care to trans youth and adults across the country. And all those things are connected. And that's one of the points that we've been making at Interrupting Criminalization through a couple of resources that we've released recently, to be like, listen, it's not like the fight for abortion care is different from the fight for gender affirming care. They're the same fight. And because the right is seeing them as the same fight to control our reproductive, sexual, and gender autonomy, we need to see them as the same fight and not engage in this transphobic, thing that cis women are engaged in right now, where they're saying, oh, we have to focus on this and not that, and focusing on trans folks and trans healthcare somehow detracts from our struggle, which it's actually the same struggle. And the sooner we figure that out, the stronger we're going to be in resistance, and the less we're going to fall into the traps that the right is laying for us in order to advance their agenda. So, and it's also, you know, part of their 30, 40, 50-year plan to bring about a society that looks very different from the one that abolitionists are trying to bring about. So I hate that they're co-opting the term abolitionist for what they're doing.
Yeah, well, and I think that there may be a mistaken notion. I don't think it necessarily is among people who share our understanding of movement building, who have followed organizing, who recognize the way that these threats metastasize and evolve. But it needs to be stated that it doesn't stop here with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, because it's not like, you know, they say it's now left up to the states, but that doesn't mean that there isn't any national framework coming from the right wing and fascistic forces that have organized for over a half century for this, you know, emboldened. They are now going to go somewhere next. And I suppose that's why I feel it's so crucial. And I'm glad that you're out there doing this kind of work, because it seems to be meaningful, a meaningful way of pushing back against what is this this toxic force. And I want to get into this example here of why there needs to be some kind of a counter to this immediately, because you're already seeing groups that supposedly are on the side of supporting abortion fold. Here is Planned Parenthood, which has multiple clinics in Montana, preemptively restricting out-of-state patients' access to abortion pills. So we're talking about medication, and that they shut it down on the claim that they needed to do so because it might expose their patients to criminal charges or lawsuits. No, what they're not saying is that they're also concerned about their own liability as Planned Parenthood and what might happen in the state. And in Montana, it's very much in flux as to whether they're going to ban abortion or not. That's something that is now being deliberated over. And, you know, on one hand, it's good, it's to be left up to the citizens. On the other hand, it shows you just how precarious things are for women. And then you hear stories within this article about how essentially women in South Dakota or bordering states that had been counting on having a place that they could go have now lost this because Planned Parenthood, while things are very much up in the air, has decided to fold and not take a courageous position and continue to offer these drugs. And so what role do we have to play in order to give these more institutionalized establishment organizations a backbone so that they do fight? Or is there something else we need to be doing? I mean, is there any place for these organizations that are not willing to fight?
I mean, I think the first thing we have to do is shout from the rooftops and make it and show the world what they're doing, and stop giving any money to Planned Parenthood. Folks should be funding the people who support people's self-determination and don't throw up, you know, claims that we're protecting you from criminal prosecution by denying you care that you need and we're counting on, right? Like, let folks make their own choices, let folks express their own agency, give them as much information and give them as much protection as you can. You know, if you're a lawyer out there and you're alarmed by what's happening right now, get in there and fight for people to be able to do, you know, what needs to be done. Don't advise people to cave before there's even a reason to cave. So before there's even a law that criminalizes what you're doing. So I feel like I definitely feel a lot of rage at that. You know, I lived next to the clinic in Binghamton in the early 90s when Operation Rescue was at, you know, full strength, and protesting and terrorizing the clinic and the community day in, day out, every single day. And, I pretty sure that was a Planned Parenthood clinic, and I was, willing to defend them in the face of that. I'm not willing to defend them in the face of the fact that they're denying people care, and I think it's really a testament to how the mainstream movement or organizations or nonprofits have evolved, that this is the position that they're taking now. And I really just want to invite folks to just call out and push and pressure and shame and demand that those organizations that are receiving millions of dollars in funding from people on the premise that they're providing people with the reproductive care they need, to actually live up to that obligation and to that mission, and also to stop giving them money and start giving it to abortion funds and abortion care networks and people who are actually providing people with care, ensuring they have access to care, and who are willing to take the risks to make sure that people have the care that they are entitled to and deserve. And to do as I was taught in law school, to bend the law until it breaks and to not obey unjust laws. But in fact, that it is our role to fight them and take risks to do that every day. So there's no words for the levels of rage and disappointment and frustration I feel when I see people, everyone from the Democratic Party to Planned Parenthood to, white feminists to whoever, just throwing up their hands, being like, oh, well, I guess if you just have to live in a state where, thank God I live in a blue state. Well, first of all, they're coming for you in the blue state. And secondly, if you are not for abortion care and reproductive justice and gender self-determination for everyone, then we're not on the same team. And we need to fight with people who are on the same team as us.
Just a brief interruption. I'd like to take this moment to encourage you to become a subscriber of the Unauthorized Disclosure Weekly Podcast. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/unauthorized-disclosure. And for a few dollars every month, you can support independent media like this show and give a few bucks every month, and you'll have access to exclusive episodes, as well as early access to all of our shows, like this conversation that we just did with Andrea Ritchie. We have guests like Andrea and others every single week for the most part. And once a month, we record an exclusive episode that is just for our patrons or subscribers. And we've been going for over 8 years, and we really value what we've been able to build, the space that we've been able to build for encouraging conversations that you just don't see in many spaces, many of the more establishment and mainstream podcast spaces. So thank you for considering supporting the Unauthorized Disclosure Weekly Podcast. And let's get back to this conversation.
Yeah, I think this really speaks to the sort of liberal response to what has taken place, which has just been pathetic and very sad, and just kind of like shrugging, vote harder. Like, the Democratic response has just been utterly shocking. Like, they had 5 weeks, I think, after that decision was leaked to prepare the groundwork to respond in some sort of effective way. And they didn't do that. And then you also see this attempt, there's this op-ed in the New York Times. I'm sure you saw, I didn't read the whole thing. I'm sure you saw the headline. It's called "The Far Right and Far Left Agree on One Thing: Women Don't Count." And it's this woman, Pamela Paul, making this ridiculous argument that tries to equate the actual stripping away of reproductive rights, which affects everyone in the country. Even if you are a man, this affects you, right? And she makes the argument that the far left is on the same level as that for being silly with language around gender issues in ways that she doesn't like. And I'm like, that's your response to this? You're really I don't even want to get into a discussion about language and, that one person on the internet who maybe sounds really silly and libs of TikTok ends up promoting to be this is how everyone on the left is. as if like, you know, everybody in every different political on the political spectrum doesn't have like characters who kind of like make their argument look a little ridiculous. I don't even want to get to that. Just even if let's be generous here and say the left is so ridiculous on the language they want us to use around gender. That does not reach the level of stripping away basic human rights. And it's just like the whole response. I'm sorry, now I'm just going on a tangent and rant, but like it's so outrageous and infuriating. The entire response from those in the so-called center to what just took place, which is just to sit back and think it's not going to affect them because they're rich and maybe they live in a blue state or a blue city, and to like try to, you know, attack the left for it. Like what? I'm just curious your response.
I mean, the same level of rage and rant. You know, the folks who are making these arguments are actually being manipulated and organized by the right. They're actually being used by the right. The right is specifically trying to drive a wedge between folks who are impacted by their actions and by their criminalization and denial and control of sexual and reproductive and gender autonomy through trans antagonism and transphobia. And they're being successful. And people like the author of that New York Times op-ed are playing right into it. And similarly, kind of the central liberals who are like, well, you know, we have to respect the rule of law from the Supreme Court that declared Black people property and said Indigenous people have no rights, and, you know, have done a million other things that make it clear what kind of institution and structure and relations of power they are about upholding, are playing directly into the hands of the right. So it's not the far left that's doing the work of the right. It's the centrists who are blaming the far left for doing the work of the right. And if the fact that we are trying to literally talk about everyone who is impacted by this decision so that we can unite, coalesce, and fight back together is being framed as problematic, then those people are actually eviscerating their own power and that of a broader movement to fight back. So it just infuriates me as how easily they're playing into the hands of the right, following exactly the playbook that the right has written for them, and somehow claiming that that is how we're going to fight the right. So I just, and the Democratic parties, I mean, it's just a never ending source of disappointment. I just can't tell you, I'm not from the US, and it's not like the places I'm from, it's not a similar neoliberal assemblage of political parties, but the ways in which the Democrats also do the work of the right by their complete failure to exercise imagination or to actually mount an effective resistance through the previous administration and the current administration tells us that we are all we have, and we can't rely on them. And we need to find the ways to fight back ourselves, and that we can't be distracted by what white liberals are doing. We need to be clear about where we stand and how and who we stand with, and to be clear that we will be on the side of everyone who is affected by efforts to control our sexual, gender, and reproductive autonomy. And that absolutely means standing with trans women, with trans men, with trans people, with non-binary people, with everyone whose reproductive, sexual, and gender autonomy is being controlled, because it's all part of the same agenda. And divide and conquer is a strategy as old as time, and we're not falling for that. And the fact that these white feminists are falling for it is not going to detract us from where we're going. So I think that's one piece. The other thing I want to point out is that people don't know that a lot of medication is being denied to people that is not related to their effort to seek abortion care or self-manage abortion or even gender-affirming care. But because it could be used for that, people are being denied that medication that is used to treat, for instance, rheumatoid arthritis, medication like contraception and hormone replacement therapy that can be used for gender-affirming care, or that can be used by folks who are menopausal or have other hormonal conditions that require gender-affirming care or for contraceptive purposes. And so I think folks also need to understand that again, our struggles are united. We are impacted by the same thing. The person who is claiming we shouldn't be fighting for gender affirming care doesn't understand that they're coming for her contraception or their contraception as part of the effort to deny gender affirming care. And so, like, just get on board, because your material conditions and circumstances are aligned, and just unlearn what the right is feeding you in an effort to divide and conquer.
And
so
what's so actually like concerning too is the way that the right has really successfully framed all of those things as like the real threat to American culture and like the American way of life is all this gender stuff and like all this like gay stuff. And at the same time, it's like they're literally stripping away people's rights and like making life really unsafe for people based on all of these things. Yet they've actually convinced a lot of just regular average people who maybe just like, you know, aren't always reading the news that the actual problem is like cancel culture and all this weird identity stuff as their rights are being stripped away. Like it's quite concerning. They've really successfully, I think, I mean, they have a more successful propaganda apparatus than the left does, that's for sure. And then, yeah, like you mentioned, liberals are just playing right into it.
I think people don't understand the role that gender plays in all the structures of power that we're living under, right? And Indigenous feminists have taught us, like, and anti-colonial feminists have taught us that imposing rigid separation and gender binaries and then hierarchies based on those gender binaries is how colonialism was imposed and implemented and maintained. And it's how power continues to be implemented and maintained through racialized and ableist and other lenses. So what folks don't understand is that patriarchy works because of the notion that there's two genders that are separate, binary, and there's no fluidity or going in between or around them. And I think if folks are really about fighting patriarchy, then they need to be about fighting that. And I think that's why the right sees gender expansiveness or liberation or self-determination as a threat, because it then threatens other hierarchies, other racialized economic and social hierarchies that they are invested in maintaining. And if feminists don't understand that, then they're not going to effectively fight patriarchy, particularly by turning against trans and gender nonconforming folks. So people need to really get a deeper understanding of who and what they're fighting if they actually want to win.
So I want to move on to a few of the ideas of interrupting criminalization. But first, I have to insert this horrible specific about one more piece of legislation, a type of legislation that is coming. I think we just need to hammer home the way in which this criminalization isn't going to just be about denying abortion, that it's going to also fundamentally attack other rights, which you're already illuminating through your comments in this episode. But in South Carolina, there is a bill that was proposed by 3 state senators. And I have it down here that they want to make it a crime to knowingly or intentionally aid, abet, or conspire with another person seeking an abortion. And that would include, quote, providing information to a pregnant woman or someone seeking any mode of communication or any information on behalf of a woman by telephone, internet, or any other mode of communication regarding self-administered abortions or the means to obtain an abortion, knowing that the information will be used or is reasonably likely to be used for an abortion. And then they also want to go after the hosting or maintaining of internet websites or the providing of access to an internet website or any internet service for the purpose of directing a pregnant woman who is a resident of South Carolina to that information. You just see how the right wing is getting creative and developing the many methods of criminalizing people and as you say, removing their bodily autonomy. And I want to put this up here. These are some of the ideas that interrupting criminalization works with, and I think it's important for us to return to something that has been a lightning rod for bad faith debate, but I'll get to it. So you have, if we care about criminalization, this is from a report, by the way, on decriminalizing abortion that Maria Thomas edited and others worked on, other groups worked on, it's put out in November 2021. If we care about criminalization, we must care about abortion criminalization. If we care about reproductive justice, we must divest from the carceral state. And then here's another thing about defunding police and how that includes reproductive justice, and reproductive justice means defunding the police. And I think that brings us to something that, we saw conversation around after George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis by police, and that sparked the uprisings that we saw throughout the country. And we had a movement moment, but now it's worked its way into establishment and in the establishment media and our culture, that defunding police is something that has been costing people elections. They've been coming up with these very destructive messages about it that are not true. But I think that tells you that, and I believe you'll probably agree with me, it tells you, and I know this is what Miriam and others' opinion is, that this framework of defunding the police has actually been tremendously effective in advancing abolitionism. And again, I think it remains something that is very useful in this moment after the overturning of Roe v. Wade.
There's no question about it. I mean, and to your point, yes, absolutely. It's been disproven that it's costing people elections. It's been shown that if people are presented with the actual agenda, which is to stop spending $130 million or $1 billion a year on policing and punishment, and instead investing that in the things people need to be safe and to prevent violence and interrupt violence and heal from violence and harm and conflict. Most people agree with that as a premise. But also, yes, it has gained so much traction that our opposition has had to mount a massive public relations campaign to delegitimize it and try to re-legitimize police in the face of what was the biggest crisis in their legitimacy, and certainly my generation, following the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade and hundreds more since. And there's absolutely continued relevance. First of all, that movement is still alive, thriving, vibrant, and fighting. And secondly, yes, folks who are concerned about criminalization of abortion through Roe v. Wade should think about who they think is going to be enforcing this. The cops that they've been calling for more funding for and more legitimacy for and more investment in over the past 4, 5, 6 decades of cultural feminism. So again, I think we really need folks to understand that these struggles are interrelated. And to the point that you were making about the South Carolina law, again, people are sort of clutching their pearls, being like, oh my God, do you really mean that for me saying to someone, here's where you can go get an abortion, I can be criminalized? Yes, welcome to the world of Black and brown people who have been subject to conspiracy law criminalization, for decades, in the war on drugs, in the sex trade, in, every possible context. And that's something that people like the National Council of Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women have been calling for an end to conspiracy liability forever. And there are people in these communities that have experienced this before who have already been sort of mounting resistance around that kind of criminalization. And we need to look to them for leadership and support, and not suddenly be like, oh my God, I can't say a thing to a friend, about where they could get abortion care. I might be criminalized. And we certainly don't want people to fold like the Montana clinic is doing and contribute to that isolation and have that contain their resistance. In fact, the more of us who resist that kind of criminalization through conspiracy on every front, the better chance we have of fighting it.
So where do we go from here? Roe has been overturned. It's up to the states. Abortion is illegal already in so many states. It's going to become illegal in others. It's going to become criminalized. Like, it's a huge, daunting uphill battle, but there is stuff that needs to be done. So what do we do? I
think you figure out how to fight where you are. You figure out in where you are, how to resource abortion funds that are making sure people get the care they need right now, how to resource providers who are, and abortion doulas, and folks who are supporting increased access online. Folks can go to ineedana.org to find out more, resource them. And then also think about who can't access, medication, abortion, or transportation. If you're already working to support incarcerated people, recognize that when you're incarcerated in a state that has criminalized abortion, that's it. You don't have access to abortion. And frankly, if you're in a state that hasn't criminalized abortion, people who are incarcerated don't get access to abortions either. So reach out, be in community with folks inside, figure out how you can support them in these moments. Reach out and support folks who are on probation and parole, whose every move is surveilled, criminalized, and under the control of the state. So if a state is trying to say, we don't want you to travel to another state to get an abortion, certainly the probation officer is going to be someone who's enforcing that and saying, no, I'm not giving you travel authorization. Find those folks, find the folks who are supporting folks on probation and parole and resisting electronic surveillance and all the other things that are going to get in the way of them being able to access abortion, and support them. Fight criminalization of conspiracy, fight criminalization of abortion, fight criminalization across the board. Continue your fight to defund police, because police are going to be the ones enforcing this. Wherever you are, if you are about fighting for health justice, make sure that providers are clear that they need to follow their prime directive. That's what the kind of network that Maria Thomas, who's our Beyond Do No Harm fellow and who wrote the document that you referred to, Kevin, is doing, is encouraging people who provide care to understand their prime directive is to do no harm. Criminalization is harm. Taking away someone's agency and ability to decide whether or not they're willing to take the risk of a civil suit or a criminal charge to get abortion care, like the Planned Parenthood clinic in Montana is doing, is harm. Do no harm if you're a medical provider. Support your medical providers in doing no harm. I think wherever you are, you can get in. And there's also on July 17th, a national sort of call that's being sponsored. I can send the link for folks to figure out to get in where you are. But the first thing I want to say is find out what folks who have been preparing for this moment and organizing around the folks who have already been being criminalized in accessing abortion and reproductive care and gender affirming care. Find out what they're already doing. Don't start something new. Don't be like, oh my gosh, I have to open up my home to people seeking abortions in Detroit right now without checking with the folks who are already doing that and have already figured out how to do that safely. Because just posting something that's not vetted, people don't understand how many fake abortion and pregnancy care and right-wing sort of fronts are out there to draw pregnant people in and do them harm and deny them care. So don't put someone at risk of not knowing whether you're legit or not. See the folks who are already doing the work, find them, get in, support, and make those connections between denial of abortion care and self-managed care, and denial of gender-affirming care and self-managed care, and frankly, denial of self-managed care through criminalization of drug use. Understand that it's all the same fight, and just get in where you are and where you can. This is a long fight. This is a big fight, and it's affecting all of us. And so this is literally about what kind of world you want to live in. It's not the time to shrink. It's not the time to fold. It's not the time to, oh, well. It's not the time to say, oh, I'll just vote in November. It's the time to figure out what you can do right now, right here, for each other, because our lives depend on it, literally.
Yeah. No, I think that's really good. I just one more thing to work in quickly. And by the way, it's just worth noting that right now we're recording this on July 8th, and we're going to be subjected to another news cycle where everyone expects us to be concerned that Judge Brett Kavanaugh can't go to dinner without being protested against. And I mean it. I just could not give a shit about what he goes through
He's taking away our rights.
Yeah,
he's literally taking away our rights. So
the fact that we're subjected to this is just it's violence. And so I just wanted to mention for people who want to be able to think about this, that Interrupting Criminalization and Project NIA and Critical Resistance, you worked on this thing about how you can assess proposals and ideas and figure out whether they are worthy of involvement and worthy of supporting, whether it's an abolitionist proposal or a strategy, and whether, in fact, it's something that's going to help do away with the power of the prison industrial complex, the power of policing, defunding policing, etc., not play into these institutions and structures that are responsible. And I just want to end by throwing out, there really are no Democrats that are coming forward with plans, but we have seen Cori Bush step up and use her own website with something that actually has the name Reproductive Justice Action Plan and support. It's probably no accident that somebody with organizing experience is trying to rise to the moment. And some of the things that she discusses, I just wanted to mention to you on our way out of this episode and get your quick response, and hear from you what your thoughts are, Andrea, on some of these things that can be done. Do you have is there any reason why people shouldn't support executive orders from the Biden White House if we could get them? Should we declare a public health emergency? What sort of things should we be demanding from our state governments? Should we be demanding immediately that they pass executive orders, issue executive orders, or pass laws that say very clearly that abortion providers are not going to be criminalized, are protected by their state laws? Is that a basic place that people can start, or is this not the way to begin?
I think that a few things. I have tremendous respect for Cori Bush and so appreciate that she's putting this out, and definitely think we should do anything we can. I think that we need to be clear and turn to people who have been fighting criminalization on multiple fronts for expertise. So, for instance, recently in New Orleans, people passed a resolution, and people were like, oh, it's going to protect people in New Orleans from prosecution. Well, it turns out, actually, it's not a ban on prosecution. It's just deprioritizing those prosecutions. So if you would come to people who have been trying to decriminalize poverty-based offenses or any other thing, we could have told you that kind of deprioritization is basically nothing. And it only benefits privileged people, and the same people who are going to be criminalized are going to continue to be criminalized under a deprioritization approach. We need a total ban. So yes, legislative protections, but come to folks who have been fighting criminalization, because we can tell you where all the loopholes are that will ensure that whatever ban is in place will only protect folks who are already privileged, and the folks who are already criminalized will continue to be criminalized. Secondly, yes, absolutely. States should be saying not just that we're not going to criminalize here, they should be offering immunity from criminalization for folks who come from other states, and saying we're not going to extradite people to those states, and we're not going to allow them to be prosecuted in other states. People should be thinking beyond what the law limits and putting out the most radical vision through law and otherwise, and let people challenge it in courts. But let's go and put out the most radical vision and protection we can for folks, for sure. And then I just want to emphasize too that we need to think about like what legal theories we're advancing and who we're depending on to enforce them, because it's I think anything, for instance, to your point earlier, Rania, about privacy and privilege as a legal theory, like privacy as a legal theory relies on the privilege of privacy. Privacy and privilege come from the same root. And these laws are going to be used and target and attack the folks who have never experienced either of those. So let's not try and recodify something that was insufficient to begin with, as in Roe, which is like you can do things in your own privacy if you have the privilege to do it and the funds and the access and you're not incarcerated and whatever. Let's demand a federal legislation or executive order that goes beyond that to universal access to legal, safe, and affirming and accessible abortion care for everyone. So I think that's the only kind of amendment I would make to the proposals, which is we're not trying to go back to the thing that only benefits the few. We want the thing that benefits everyone. And while people are doing executive orders, they can repeal the Hyde Amendment and make it possible for people to go on federal land, to veterans hospitals, to any kind of federal facility and in federal prisons to get a funded abortion. Like there's so much more that we could be demanding than what is kind of on the table now. And that's,
Mhm.
I really want people to think beyond the existing legal frameworks and possibilities.
It's a difference between coping and blazing a new way
Exactly.
forward that actually
Exactly.
protects people.
Exactly.
Thank you, Andrea, for joining us. If you want to quickly let people know where they can go to support your work, or if there's any particular initiative you want people to donate to and fund, go ahead, and then we'll wrap.
Please give your money to National Abortion Funds and the Partners in Health Clinic that Mariam has been running a fundraiser for through the t-shirt that you're wearing. Get your t-shirt. And you can find out more about that at interruptingcriminalization.com, and follow us on social at interruptcrim. And really encourage folks to download our 2 most recent briefs, one on abortion criminalization that you quoted from, the other one on protecting and gender affirming care for trans youth. And get in on that national call on the 17th to find out where you can jump into this fight. And welcome everyone. We need all of us.
All right. Thank you, Andrea.
Thanks.
Thanks again for watching. And if you'd like to get a shirt, you can get this shirt or this shirt, which says "Not 1 second of peace," a message that Justice Brett Kavanaugh must hear over and over again repeatedly. So you can go to the store on bonfire.com/store/prison-cultures-store. Prison Culture Store. You can look for Prison Culture Store on bonfire.com, and you'll find these shirts that were designed for the purpose of raising funds for expanding abortion access. Right now, the funds are going to a health center, a women's health center in Alabama, where abortion has been made illegal as a result of Roe v. Wade being overturned. And the clinic cannot provide abortions, but they're working on other means of providing reproductive health care that we know Alabama will try to criminalize. And then there are 2 resources that I direct you to that come from Interrupting Criminalization. One is a resource on abortion decriminalization and it being a part of the larger struggle against policing and criminalization. You'll find some insights on how movements may organize in solidarity with each other. And then another resource is "We Must Fight in Solidarity with Trans Youth," and drawing connections between our movements. Both of these come from Interrupting Criminalization, of which our guest Andrea Ritchie was a co-founder. So with that, I thank you for watching the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast, and we will be back next week with another show.